So, you want to play Outlaws of Alkenstar. Hello and welcome back to Pathfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Today's video is another video player's guide, this time focusing on a low-level AP defined in large part by its setting, Outlaws of Alkenstar. For those unfamiliar with my player's guides, this video will provide a brief overview of the structure and themes of the campaign, while remaining light on spoilers. I'll provide a rundown of the setting and lore leading up to the campaign, then dig into some mechanical options players can select to have a thematic connection to the story, including ancestries, classes, and religious options. I'll also be adding a little GM advice at the end, since this AP, as written, needs a little bit of tweaking before it can be run seamlessly. Before I go any further, I should also lay out my sources for this video. If you're planning to play in Outlaws of Alkenstar, you or your GM will need access to all 3 of the books in the AP, plus at least the Guns and Gears sourcebook. I also suggest the Lost Omens Impossible Lands book for GMs, as it provides excellent background information for this campaign. Additionally, because of the particular quirks of Outlaws of Alkenstar as a campaign, and the weirdness of the setting, I will be strongly suggesting several third-party products from Pathfinder Infinite to allow players a greater degree of flexibility when building their characters to make them appropriate for this campaign. These include The Way of the Gunsmith by Daniel Vitti and Arcanum Press, and the following publications from Team Plus: Inventors Plus, Witches Plus, Barbarians Plus, Magus Plus, and Impossible Lands Plus. With that out of the way, let's start with the campaign outline. Outlaws of Alkenstar is a 3-part adventure path which takes player characters from 1st through 10th level. It is the 8th adventure path which Paizo has produced for 2nd edition, covering books 178, 179, and 180 in the Adventure Path product line. As usual, the official player's guide for this campaign has been published online for free by Paizo, and is available at the link in the video description. Broadly speaking, Outlaws of Alkenstar is a campaign dripping in theme and atmosphere, which benefits greatly from its setting, the Grand Duchy of Alkenstar in the mana wastes of the Impossible Lands. Alkenstar is a unique location, even on a planet as interesting as Golarion. The city-state exists in a location where magic is unreliable, and so clockwork and firearms have risen to take its place as the major source of military power. As such, Outlaws of Alkenstar merges the aesthetics and trappings of the mythical American Old West with a distinctly North African take on a steampunk metropolis. From a narrative perspective, Outlaws of Alkenstar leans hard into the themes of justice and revenge, like so many great cowboy stories. The PCs will find themselves confronting lawmen and criminals alike throughout this AP, and should feel a strong personal motivation to take down their opponents throughout the story. The criminal underworld more broadly plays a major role in the story, and the PCs will be expected to navigate it and unravel a criminal conspiracy with multiple dangerous power players involved. Despite this, the PCs will also be faced with a number of time-sensitive, high-intensity mechanical challenges, like heists, break-ins, chases, and escapes. These themes combine nicely to make the whole AP drip with atmosphere. The PCs in Outlaws of Alkenstar take on the role of the titular outlaws, though they are not expected to be sadistic criminals or dangerous killers. In truth, the PCs are intended to play outlaws with hearts of gold, fundamentally good, or at least not actively evil, characters who have been either wrongfully outlawed or whose crimes have been blown wildly out of proportion. The PCs are expected to be residents of Alkenstar City or the surrounding area, and should be willing to work toward the city's success and future. Alright, so what are we doing here? Outlaws of Alkenstar features a group of PCs who have all been declared outlaws by the government of Alkenstar, meaning they no longer benefit from the protection of the state. The PCs have been accused of a variety of crimes, but two characters connect all their stories: Ambrose Mugland and Angelique Lovelace. Ambrose Mugland is a known crime lord in Alkenstar City, with holdings in a variety of business and criminal interests. Angelique Lovelace, meanwhile, is a shield marshal, a member of the local Alkenstari constabulary. She is widely suspected to be corrupt, though she is also known to be a dangerous and effective enforcer of order on Alkenstar's streets. These two characters are heavily implicated in the plots which led to the downfall of each of the PCs, and they are suspected to have worked together in the past. With this setup, the campaign, at least in the early phase, becomes a quest to prove the PC's innocence and bring down the plots and schemes of Mugland and Lovelace. So, we have our motivation, but where do we begin our story? The campaign kicks off with the PCs having been contacted by a stranger, Phoebe Dunsmith, the owner of the Barrel and Bullet Saloon in the Ferris Quarter neighborhood of Alkenstar City. Phoebe has brought the PCs together because she and they have a common enemy, Ambrose Mugland. Though Phoebe won't disclose her particular beef with Mugland, she's made her intentions very clear. She wants the PCs to rob the Gold Tank Reserve, a bank which Mugland owns in the Smokeside district. In addition to providing the PCs with some basic information on the structure and promising them a fair share of the spoils, she's even suggested using the nearby Whaling Scrapyard as an escape. I won't get too much more into detail on the first chapter of the story here, since the planning of the heist could be a solid roleplay opportunity for your table. Instead, I'm going to zoom out a bit and look at the campaign as a whole. Throughout the entirety of the AP, PCs will face a nice mix of conventional combat encounters, social challenges, and subsystem-based challenges like chases. While players who build their characters exclusively as combat powerhouses will likely still have a good time, it would be better if each PC had a nice balance of combat and non-combat abilities. Chases and victory point challenges like heists are somewhat common, so PCs should be prepared to recognize when fighting to the death isn't the intended outcome. Looking at the combat design elements in specific, Outlaws of Alkenstar makes heavy use of clockwork and construct enemies. These enemies commonly have resistance to physical damage types, even at low levels, meaning PCs who employ weapons with low damage dice might struggle. These same constructs and clockwork are also typically immune to mental effects. Mental specialists like bards might find this difficult to work with, as might characters who focus on feinting, intimidation, or diplomacy in combat. That being said, these same construct creatures typically have weakness to electricity damage. Beyond these constructs, enemies who have immunity to precision damage, like swarms and oozes, are relatively common in this AP. For this reason, rogues, investigators, and swashbucklers might struggle in specific combats. Outside of combat, several skills will stand out as especially relevant throughout this campaign. That's not to say that other skills will not be useful, only that these are the skills which will really have moments to shine. Of the lore skills, engineering lore, Alkenstar lore, and Bry lore will all crop up with regularity. Of the 5 primary knowledge skills, religion and society will be the most useful by far, since arcana and occultism will have limited applicability in Alkenstar. Thievery and crafting will help characters understand and disable mechanical devices, which will be present throughout the whole story, especially in the form of clockwork. Athletics, stealth, and acrobatics will all be about evenly useful, so at least one member of the party should be able to perform each of these skills with a degree of competence. Because of the complexity of the underworld in Alkenstar, all 3 of the primary social skills, diplomacy, deception, and intimidation, will be useful. But bear in mind that mindless enemies are common enough that these skills might not experience their typical levels of usefulness in combat. Finally, in Book 2 of the AP, the nature and survival skills will stand out as being useful, but this really won't be the case for Books 1 and 3, so if you don't put skill increases into these skills until you hit about level 4, you'll probably be okay. I should also mention that medicine will be as useful in this campaign as it ever is. The official player's guide from Paizo could be read as indicating that medicine isn't a good idea for this campaign, but that is definitely not the intended takeaway. Paizo was simply trying to indicate that medicine won't be useful from a story perspective, outside of its normal use case of keeping the party alive. As usual for me, I think every party should have at least one member, preferably two, who is skilled in medicine. The history and founding of Alkenstar. In -892 AR, more than 5,000 years ago, the powerful archwizards Nex and Geb declared war upon one another. Each of these two mage kings ruled a nation which they'd named after themselves, Nex in the north and Geb in the south. Each of these two kingdoms was an absolute arcane and military powerhouse, and the archwizards who ruled them could bring tremendous magical powers to bear against one another. From Nex, monstrous living constructs created in the nation's infamous flesh forges marched south into the desert. Meanwhile, the necromancers of Geb unleashed horde after horde of terrible undead soldiers. Beyond these living or undead servants, the wizards Nex and Geb continuously devised increasingly dangerous spells and rituals to hurl at one another, each one seeking an edge over the other. This contest lasted for 1,300 years, during which time the land between the two nations became saturated in lingering experimental magic. This magic slowly began to have unintended effects on the environment, and by the war's conclusion, the land had become a wasteland, plagued by randomly occurring magical storms, populated by mutated animals and humanoids whose exposure to the unpredictable magics of the land left them deformed and imbued with strange and unexplainable powers. These were the Mana Wastes, a strip of uncontrolled territory in the Impossible Lands, which nowadays runs east to west between the Obari Ocean and the Shattered Range Mountains. The whole territory is about 50 to 70 miles wide and runs for a length of about 450 miles, making it about half the size of the state of Tennessee. Much of the Mana Wastes consists of a desert called the Spellscar Desert in the Age of Lost Omens. The whole region is extraordinarily inhospitable, with localized surges of wild magic, which cause spellcasters to trigger wellspring magic effects as defined in Secrets of Magic. Additionally, the planar barriers are extremely thin in the Mana Wastes, meaning effects from the elemental or even outer planes can easily leak into the region at any time. And into this inhospitable land stepped Ancestors Alkenstar. In 4588 AR, only about 140 years ago at the time of this campaign, Ancestors Alkenstar, a skilled clockwork researcher from Nex, was forced to flee from his homeland to avoid being arrested. He escaped into the Mana Wastes and survived by brokering an alliance between the nomadic Ustrati humans who lived in the Mana Wastes and the other outlaws and fugitives like Ansel himself. As this alliance began to stabilize, due in large part to the efforts of the Ustrati, Ancestors Alkenstar recognized the need for some kind of lasting power to ensure his community's ongoing stability. With that in mind, he set off into the crags to the west until he found the remnants of Dongun Hold. The sky citadel Dongun Hold, unbeknownst to most, still played host to a whole civilization of hyper-isolationist dwarves. These dwarves had hidden themselves in a magic-dead vault beneath the earth to avoid the terrible magic of the Nex-Geb War. With no access to magic, the Donguni dwarves had worked with their Kulanet cousins to develop black powder. Firearms soon followed, and this rapid technological advancement, coupled with the dwarves' ancestral mastery over defensive works, made Dongun Hold a mighty fortress in the chaotic danger of the Mana Wastes. So, when Ancestors Alkenstar, rogue inventor, showed up on their doorstep proposing an alliance, the Donguni dwarves were naturally a bit suspicious. But High King Anong Aranak, acting against the advice of her viziers, listened to Ansel's proposal, and saw the wisdom in his words. She declared an alliance between Dongun Hold and Ansel's fledgling nation, and gave him and his followers access to gunpowder and firearms. In turn, Ancil traded his expertise in clockwork and constructs, allowing the dwarves to rapidly increase their mechanical understanding and strengthen their production capacity. With this alliance secured, Ancil returned to his followers, and they set to the long and bitter work of nation-building. They established a city on the banks of the Ustrati River, where it turned northward and tumbled down the Hell-Fallen Cliffs. Following the naming conventions of the local tribes, the nation elected to name itself after its leader, and thus Alkenstar City was born. In 4601, the leaders of Alkenstar commissioned the construction of the Gunworks. Recognizing the importance of firearms to their future, the Alkenstari elected to create a centralized location outside of the city proper, where the dangerous work of gunsmithing could be performed without endangering the local populace. In 4620, the Gunworks was finally completed, and the mass production of firearms for which Alkenstar would one day be known finally began. Alkenstar Today. The Grand Duchy of Alkenstar is an industrial marvel, with all the triumphs and tragedies that entails. The Alkenstari have carved an incredible, if unstable, existence for themselves, threatened on all sides by archmages, wasteland raiders, and unpredictable magic storms. Their innovative spirit and willingness to cooperate has persevered in the face of these challenges, creating a nation which allows for personal advancement outside of the normal channels of nobility and politicking. At the same time, the city-state plays host to a level of labor exploitation which only an industrial revolution could allow, with labor disputes and union busting which would seem all too familiar to those who know their real-world history here on Earth. Manifest destiny is a common feeling among the elites of Alkenstar, alongside the belief that their financial success indicates their superiority to those around them who still struggle in poverty. Still, the Alkenstari are a proud people, and remain largely unified when faced with the many existential threats which surround them. The culture of Alkenstar is built on a base of cooperation, which traces all the way back to the Ustrati tribes of humans who took in Ancil Alkenstar. They granted him sanctuary for 1 year to save him from the mana wastes, but after that he was required to earn their hospitality by contributing to the success of the tribe. He fulfilled this promise by teaching the Ustrati the art of clockwork creation, and by winning the loyalty of the Donguni dwarves. This tradition of welcoming outsiders with the understanding that they will eventually contribute to the success of the community persists into the modern day. Refugees, outsiders, and explorers are all welcomed with open arms, though the city makes special efforts to recruit migrants with technical or alchemical backgrounds. People from all walks of life can be accepted in Alkenstar, so long as they prove willing to work, or have a mind for numbers and metal. Of course, this all comes with the caveat that most Alkenstari are tremendously prejudiced against those who have been mutated by the environmental hazards of the mana wastes. Mana waste mutants are seen as both pitiable and villainous, victims to be helped when possible, but also dangerous threats to be eliminated when necessary. The term mutant is commonly thrown around in Alkenstar, but it unfortunately lacks a concrete scientific definition, despite the city's focus on scientific progress and discovery. Instead, mutant is thrown around to describe anyone who doesn't look like a conventional human, gnome, elf, dwarf, or halfling. This could include dromar, goblins, ratfolk, kolo, and any planar scion, in addition to people born with naturally occurring birth defects, physical disabilities, or other so-called deformities. The extent to which these quote-unquote unconventional-looking people are hated ebbs and flows with the state of Alkenstar's moral panic about mutants at any given time. Even so, Alkenstar still boasts a societal and class structure which is far more meritocratic than most places in the Inner Sea region. And, while there are plenty of entrenched interests which combat this meritocracy, it is still true that hard work, cleverness, and a little luck can propel even the poorest urchin to fortune and success in Alkenstar, to a much greater extent than most other locations on Golarion. Nowhere is this better represented than in the annual Observation and Research Expeditions, These yearly airship-based excursions into the Mana Wastes fuel Alkenstar's constant need for information. Each ship spends its days taking measurements and readings to better understand the mysteries of the Mana Wastes, and seeks out new resources to be harvested and exploited. These missions are staffed by citizens from all walks of life, using a rigorous selection process open to rich and poor alike, which seeks out the best scientists, soldiers, mechanics, and explorers, regardless of class or background. Most of the poorest children of Alkenstar look to these expeditions with hope, dreaming of one day becoming one of the heroic observers and escaping their poverty. As a natural extension of this emphasis on merit and hard work, public education and formal apprenticeships are extremely common throughout the city. At the lowest levels, even in the poorest neighborhoods of Smokeside, community-funded schools educate local children to ensure public literacy and propagate the basic fundamentals of science and mathematics. Beyond the level of basic education, formal systems of apprenticeship are fairly common in the city, especially for specialty fields ranging from alchemy and clockwork design to glass-blowing and industrial machine maintenance. Even less specialized fields might involve formal training through trade unions. At the highest levels of academics, multiple prestigious universities exist within the city, from the College of the Resplendent Vault, funded by the churches of Abadar and Bry, to the Alloy College, funded by the Brass Guild. Beyond these systems for education and personal development, innumerable guilds, unions, collectives, and secret societies exist all throughout Alkenstari society. This practice evolved from that same Ustrati collaborative spirit, which birthed the city itself. As culture within the burgeoning city-state solidified, then stratified, people from similar classes and industries quickly realized that they had common interests, at which point they formalized their association with one another through membership in formal organizations intended to serve their collective will. This cultural practice has spread all the way to the poorest peoples of Alkenstar, leading to the prevalence of gangs, protection rackets, criminal conspiracies, and even mutual aid networks among the poor. Ambrose Mugland, for instance, is a powerful mob boss with an extensive network of criminal and legitimate enterprises at his command. On the more positive end of the spectrum, the urchin gang known as Espara's Paladins protects its members, all of whom are orphans and most of whom are homeless, from exploitation by the powerful. Even with these formal networks for advancement and discovery, however, singularly gifted scientists making rapid and unpredictable discoveries and advancements is one of the hallmarks of Alkenstari culture. The most famous example of this is Professor Radpool, a gnome who has recently redesigned the tin-wound hydro plant, which generates steam power from the waters of the mighty Ustrati River. Thanks to Radpool's improvements, the facility now also functions as a water purification site, providing free, clean water to all the citizens of Alkenstar. This grand tradition of genius inventors continues in Alkenstar to this day, though not all the discoveries and advancements are so benign. Recently, for example, the talented Nexian alchemist Vashon Gattleby has revealed a new alchemical explosive agent called pyronite, which he demonstrated by blowing apart a solid adamantine safe and nearly leveling an entire lecture hall with a sample no larger than a pea. One of the quirks of Alkenstari culture, which sets it apart from a generic Wild West setting, is the local view on alcohol. The dominance of the faith of Bry has led to a broad condemnation of foods which have been deemed illogical, chief among them being alcohol. Booze is very rarely consumed by locals, except on special occasions, though there is no law against such acts. Instead, beverages which increase focus or energy, namely coffee and tea, are common. One exception to this avoidance of alcohol is the large-scale production of Alkenstar's famous ice wine. This wine is formed from the freak magic blizzards of the Mana Wastes, which flash freeze the local berries and infuse them with vitality or positive energy. This infusion allows the berries to be fermented into a wine, which has the unique ability to provide a sensation of drunkenness to undead beings. Ice wine is rarely, if ever, consumed by the local Alkenstari, and is instead sold as a valuable export to the undead nation of Geb to the south. While activities like drinking might be avoided due to the way they dull the mind, the same cannot be said of gambling, though even this has a distinct Alkenstari flavor. Rather than poker, however, the favorite local game is called Coaches. Coaches involves players taking turns rolling dice and moving pieces across a board. The board represents the mana wastes, while the pieces represent a caravan of goods and travelers. The dice rolls simulate the various challenges the wastes can throw at travelers. The player who removes the most tokens off the board wins. The popularity of this pastime is likely related to the risk management aspect of the game, which is a skill that all Alkenstari must master if they ever intend to find success in the city. The gaming scene serves as a microcosm of the local differences present in the city. The wealthy elite tend toward a high-risk, high-reward playstyle, while poor laborers favor a risk-averse strategy focused on mitigating losses. While the government of Alkenstar has made it a crime to openly bet on games of coaches, the citizens have famously devised a workaround involving the purchasing of flowers, which can be exchanged for more liquid assets, with the flower growers taking a cut off the top. Tellingly, the city government has simply chosen to tax the flower salesman. Speaking of government, the Grand Duchy of Alkenstar certainly is an oddity in regional politics. Officially, the city-state is a Duchy of Nex, the magic-fueled superpower to the north. That said, this is little more than a convenient lie that everyone chooses to maintain, as Nex would never be willing to commit the forces necessary to retain direct control over the region. Instead, Alkenstar acts as a functionally independent constitutional monarchy. The head of state is the Grand Duke or Duchess, a chief executive who is appointed by the High Parliament. The High Parliament, meanwhile, is a nominally elected body, representing the various factional interests throughout the city, though many of their members still possess large fortunes or noble titles. The Equipoise Council, then, is a body of 3 additional officials who have check and balance power against both the Grand Duke or Duchess and the High Parliament. These 3 officials, the Ironmaster, High Armorer, and Lord Chamberlain, are all appointed by the Grand Duke or Duchess when they take power. The current Grand Duchess is Trietta Riccia, a popular inventor who began her career as an adventurer after having grown up as an immigrant in the poor Smokeside district. Though she has noble blood tracing back to Cheliax, she is popular among the working class as a lover of machinery and hard work. She is opposed in some regard by the descendants of Ancil Alkenstar himself, who form a sort of shadow government. That House Alkenstar controls a large minority of the seats in the High Parliament is an open secret, though they are rarely outright malicious or even greedy in their efforts. They merely exert more control than they rightfully should in a supposedly meritocratic republic. Laws in Alkenstar are enforced by the Shield Marshals, the city-state's famous and feared police. The Shield Marshals are universally skilled marksmen, and typically consist of rangers, gunslingers, fighters, investigators, and rogues, who have received special training to excel in the tight quarters of Alkenstar's crowded streets and treacherous back alleys. They answer directly to the High Shield Marshal, who in turn reports to the Ironmaster. Famously, corruption is no stranger to the overworked Shield Marshals, and the current High Shield Marshal, Zakim Adara, was appointed to the position after a particularly bad corruption scandal racked the organization. One law, which newcomers might find fascinating, given Alkenstar's reputation, is the licensure of firearms. Personal firearm licenses are rare outside of the nobility, and the Alkenstari state has a monopoly on firearms production. Still, the inventiveness of the citizens is difficult to contain, and homemade firearms are relatively common, license or no. Alkenstar does have a formal military, though career soldiers aren't particularly common. Instead, the city relies on a long tradition of conscription to defend the city in times of danger, and the citizens are all too willing to step up to defend their homes. 2 years of service in the military is compulsory for all citizens, though exceptionally dangerous assignments can earn an early retirement in as little as a year or even less. Migrants seeking quick acceptance can volunteer for conscription to practically guarantee their citizenship. Outside of the formal systems of government and law enforcement, the churches of both Bry and Abadar hold significant sway in Alkenstar. Abadarians hold their usual positions as bankers, lawyers, judges, and record keepers, and they enthusiastically support the state apparatus. Alkenstar is also one of the few places on Golarion where the faith of Bry holds a place of prominence. High Clockmother Athenth Lanalar is the head of the Bryite Church in the city, and her organization directs many educational and engineering efforts in the city. The churches of Bry and Abadar also collaborate on the production of the Whisper Sheets, the local daily newspapers which provide hour-by-hour predictions of the magical weather heading toward the city. These Whisper Sheets are critically important to the city's infrastructure, and are produced using the weather measurements made by the annual observation and research expeditions. And discussing the mana storms brings me nicely to Alkenstar's geography. When constructing their new city, Ancil Alkenstar and the Ustrati clan leaders made a bold decision. To reflect the inherent audacity of their attempts to forge a new civilization in the Mana Wastes, Alkenstar City was constructed atop the Hell-Fallen Cliffs, a 500-foot-high rock wall which runs east to west through the Mana Wastes. The sheer cliff face to the north provides an impressive natural fortification, though it brings with it some serious logistical hurdles. The city was constructed on the banks of the mighty Ustrati River, which tumbles down the cliffs at the Alken Falls, though these falls prevent easy transportation to the north and east. More on that in a minute. The Ustrati River does, however, allow for transport to the south and west, and riverboat and barge traffic constantly flows upstream to the Gunworks on the banks of Lake Ustrati. The Ustrati River bisects Alkenstar City, dividing it into its two principal districts, Smokeside and Skyside. Smokeside is the poorer of the two, and exists within a permanent magic-dead bubble. According to the official canon, no magic of any tradition functions in Smokeside, though alchemy appears to function as normal. While this makes life in Smokeside fairly dangerous, given the lack of magical healing, it also makes it particularly safe from the mana storms which can impact the region, and also renders the citizens of Smokeside safe from magical effects like scrying. Smokeside as a district is defined, at least economically, by exploitation. Industrial labor, primarily in factories, is the primary means by which the citizens of Smokeside earn a living. The large number of factories within the district even gave it its name. The entire district is constantly covered in a layer of smoke and smog, and soot covers most of the buildings. The peoples of Smokeside are generally underrepresented in the city government, and are forced to rely on one another to succeed in Alkenstar's cutthroat economy. That said, more than a few unscrupulous individuals have exploited the opportunities which Smokeside presents. Multiple criminal gangs have risen up in the district, and the shield marshals have had little success clearing them out. Even so, the peoples of Smokeside have proven their strength and inventiveness time and again. Smokesiders have built a culture which is a true melting pot, mixing aspects of cultures from all over Golarion into a colorful, vibrant, and fascinating mix which is truly unique. Across the river, the magnificent Skyside district stands in stark contrast to Smokeside's grim and grit. Skyside earned its name from the height of the proto-skyscrapers, which gave the district its distinct skyline. These towers rise high enough to escape the smoke which blankets the city, even on the most polluted days, giving the wealthy elites a view of the clear sky, which is a rare luxury in Alkenstar. Skyside is the district which houses the elites of the city, business tycoons, noble houses, and the headquarters of the various major churches in the city. The city government operates out of Kasbah Alkenstar, on the banks of the Ustrati River, and the city's various colleges and universities are almost all located in Skyside. And, of course, I would be remiss in my coverage of Alkenstar City if I didn't discuss the unique weather patterns which affect the metropolis in a bit more detail. Alkenstar City is plagued by an odd weather system which is derived from the mana storms of the Mana Wastes. In short, invisible magical pockets periodically blanket the city, sort of like high or low pressure systems, which wax and wane without being easily noticed. These magical pockets are collectively referred to as Bronzetime and Surgetime. Bronzetime refers to times when there is no magical pocket over the city, meaning spells and magic function normally. Surgetime, by contrast, refers to times when wild magic has enveloped the city and all spells have a chance of triggering unintended and dangerous side effects. Bronzetime and Surgetime become an important aspect of life in Alkenstar City, but especially in Skyside, where magic is still functional. Smokeside is, in some ways, protected from the effects of Bronzetime and Surgetime, since the entire district is perpetually magic dead. That said, during Surgetime, many shield marshals are regularly pulled out of Smokeside to better protect Skyside, leaving the poorer neighborhoods more vulnerable to crime and lawlessness. Luckily for everyone, the churches of Bry and Abadar have worked out a method of predicting the periods of Bronze and Surgetime. These predictions take the data gathered from the annual observation and research expeditions and combine them with daily magical and meteorological measurements to produce hour-by-hour assessments of Bronzetime and Surgetime designations. These reports are published each day in the city's whisper sheets, alongside news reports, advertisements, and serial fiction. The Church of Bry handles the weather prediction aspect of these publications, while the Church of Abadar handles the logistical aspects of the publication, from printing to distribution. This also leads to the unique treatment for spellcasters in Alkenstar, and especially in Skyside. Many of the people of Alkenstar have an outright irrational fear of spellcasters, and especially spellcasters whose power is derived from innate manifestation, rather than careful study or religious devotion. This fear is rooted in a concern for the dangers which unregulated spellcasters present during Surgetime, since even low-level sorcerers or oracles could easily cause widespread devastation due to the wellspring surges they can set off. Still, there is one institution of magical study in Alkenstar, which focuses on teaching spellcasters to control their powers. Blythier College focuses its curriculum on understanding the magical effects of the mana wastes, and on pushing forward alchemical research to mitigate the dangers which limiting magic in the city can present. During Surgetime, spellcasters in the city are subject to a strict curfew, limiting their movement to the grounds of the university, and thus limiting the danger they can present to the citizenry. This curfew has not been explained in much detail, so I'm not sure if or how it applies to priests in the major churches of the city. I assume clerics of Bry, for instance, have some kind of license to continue moving throughout the city, but I have no evidence to back up this claim. And this is where I need to make a big caveat to everything I have described thus far about Alkenstar's unique magical environment. The magic-dead nature of Smokeside, and the presence of Bronze and Surgetime in the city, along with the accompanying spellcaster curfew, is all officially part of the Pathfinder canon. But it is not in any way reflected in the mechanics of the Outlaws of Alkenstar adventure path. There is no mechanical rule in the AP which limits spellcasting in the Smokeside district. There is no official implementation of Bronzetime or Surgetime, or how wellspring magic might manifest during Surgetime in Skyside. There is no mechanical penalty for casting spells and ignoring the curfew in Skyside. Paizo elected to treat the mechanics of the setting for this AP more like the mechanics of any other setting. So you could reasonably play a spellcaster in this campaign with no actual mechanical problems. If you want to play the campaign in a way more reflective of the actual Alkenstar setting, then you'll need to work with your GM to figure out the best way to implement that. I have some suggestions for GMs near the end of this video for how they might implement these changes, so I strongly suggest talking to your GM about your table's collective expectations for the campaign. Before I move on to the Gunworks and Dongun Hold, I just want to briefly cover two more notable locations in Alkenstar City. The Bridge of the Gods was once a monumental construction project founded by a collection of religious zealots. The structure was originally intended to bridge the entirety of the mana wastes, functioning as an elevated superhighway out of the region. Instead, the project floundered and was eventually abandoned, only to be taken over by the city government. The scope was then scaled back a bit to be more reasonable, and the project was eventually completed. The Bridge of the Gods now functions as an elevated causeway to Dongun Hold, allowing for easy transit between the two cities. The Alkenstar Falls, which I've mentioned earlier, once completely prevented river travel from Lake Ustrati into Nex. Nowadays, however, the Alkenstari benefit from an inventive mechanical solution. An enormous rotating cylinder has been constructed at the base of the falls, which generates mechanical power to raise and lower an enormous metal grate. The grate is large enough to carry small boats and barges from one side of the falls to the other, enabling continuous trade along the length of the Ustrati River. Still, this process is incredibly slow, requiring many hours to make even a single one-way trip. Locals have dubbed this enormous mechanical device the screw, a name which has a double meaning, referencing both the rotation of the cylinder as well as the immense cost burden which the citizens had to cover to fund the construction. Regardless of just how screwed they were by this project, the peoples of Alkenstar have taken advantage of the situation by constructing a cliffside neighborhood which allows easy access to the platform as it travels up and down the falls. Called Hellside, this neighborhood is built into the rock of the Hell-Fallen Cliffs, and caters to the whims of the bored merchants and travelers who are stuck waiting for their ships to climb or descend the Alken Falls. The citizens of Hellside offer food, drink, and entertainment to travelers, though the neighborhood has expanded since its founding to include more conventional housing as well. The Gunworks. Out to the west, on the banks of Lake Ustrati, the mighty factory fortress called the Gunworks stands resolute against the dangers of the Mana Wastes. The Gunworks was constructed as a state-owned and state-operated production facility for all firearms produced within the Grand Duchy of Alkenstar. As a result, it is constantly supplied with large quantities of steel and gunpowder. The denizens of the Gunworks are a curious mix of scientists, machinists, smiths, and soldiers. And their primary focus is on the scientific development of new firearms and the mass production of weapons to fuel Alkenstar's defensive needs. Regular shipments of materials arrive from Alkenstar, and corresponding shipments of completed firearms regularly travel downriver by barge to Alkenstar City. Despite its primary function as a firearm production facility, however, the Gunworks also serves a distinctly military purpose. Lake Ustrati serves as the primary source of water for Alkenstar City, providing hydration for the city's massive population, and also providing hydropower to fuel the city's industrial production. This source of water is incredibly precious, and the Gunworks is well situated to defend the lake. For this reason, the Gunworks has developed into a fortress, equipped with some of the most dangerous large-caliber guns the Alkenstari engineers can devise. Historically, the mutant giants of the Mana Wastes presented the greatest threat to the Gunworks. These giants are incredibly tempted by the firearms which the Gunworks produce. They regularly attempt to seize these firearms to better equip themselves to face the dangers of the Mana Wastes, and to empower themselves and their allies to enslave weaker giants to their will. Every summer, the giants step up their raiding efforts and mount concerted attacks against the Gunworks. Famously, the massive cannon called the Great Maw of Rovagug, capable of firing shells more than 50 miles, has repeatedly driven off giant raids in the past. The soldiers of the Gunworks are well trained and have plenty of experience at repelling these raids, but this season still presents a serious danger to the inhabitants of the Gunworks. This danger has led the soldiers and rangers of the Gunworks to devise a clever and unconventional solution. As the engineers of the Gunworks have developed increasingly advanced firearm designs, the fortress has slowly built up a stockpile of antiquated or outdated weapons. These weapons have limited use to the Alkenstari, but are extremely valuable to the giants of the Wastes. The soldiers of the Gunworks have thus developed a strategy of dropping caches of these old firearms in the territory of weak giant tribes, allowing these giants to collect the weapons and hit above their weight class when fighting rival tribes. The conflicts which result from this strategy serve to cull the most dangerous giant populations, and Alkenstar field agents have successfully retrieved these old guns from battlefields in the Wastes with a degree of consistency. Despite this history of giant raiding, however, the dangers to Lake Ustrati itself have in recent years been coming from international threats. Saboteurs from Geb have begun making incursions into Alkenstar territory, and more than a few have made attempts to necromantically poison the waters of the lake. This presents a serious threat to the peoples of Alkenstar, but the soldiers of the Gunworks need to be careful when confronting this challenge. Confronting the agents of Geb directly could easily lead to a full-scale war, but doing nothing could result in the deaths of thousands. Conveniently, the conflicts among the giants present an opportunity in this regard as well. The giants are no friends to the agents of Geb, and a conveniently placed cache of weapons can very easily draw the giants into the vicinity of a group of Gebite saboteurs. Dongun Hold. Before I begin this section, I want to clarify that the Outlaws of Alkenstar AP does not take the players to Dongun Hold. I'm covering the Dwarven Sky Citadel because I feel it presents good additional background information for the setting, and also because the dwarves are my favorite ancestry in the game, and the dwarves of Dongun Hold are my favorite of the dwarves of Golarion. Dongun Hold presents a fascinating contrast to Alkenstar City. Unlike the science-minded inventors of Alkenstar proper, the dwarves of the ancient Sky Citadel are torn between the security provided by embracing their ancestral traditions and the potential progress presented by embracing a new lifestyle in an evolving world. 3 factions wield power in Dongun Hold: the Keepers of the Skyflame, which represent tradition, the Goldhand Lodge, which pursues profit and trade, and the Sparkforge Collective, which focuses on the development of new firearms. The interests of these 3 factions are balanced by the charismatic High King Anong Arunak, who works hard to guide her people through the trying times of the Age of Lost Omens. Dongun Hold was founded on the orders of Targic, the first High King of the Dwarves, who led the quest for Sky in the Age of Darkness. Targic placed his friend and lieutenant Arnhild Arunak in command of the mission to establish a new outpost Sky Citadel in Garund. Arnhild succeeded in establishing this city and was eventually crowned the first High King of Dongun Hold. As the centuries wore on, the human empire of Osirian eventually rose to power in northern Garund, and the Donguni dwarves struck up a close alliance with the Osiriani. This trade relationship proved incredibly successful to both parties and resulted in a high degree of cultural exchange between the two societies. With the ignition of the Nexgeb War, however, this prosperity came to an end. The dangers of the war threatened to wipe out the entirety of Donguni civilization, down to the life of the last dwarven child. In the face of such dangers, the dwarves made a difficult decision. They abandoned their Sky Citadel and fled into the Darklands. The dwarves worked a strange combination of magic rituals and explosive alchemy to create a magic dead pocket in and around the earth beneath the Sky Citadel, creating a vault in the Darklands where they would be safe from the battles of the archmages on the surface. This isolation succeeded in keeping the dwarves safe, but also forced them to separate themselves from the divine powers of their gods. As the years wore on, the Donguni dwarves, already of mixed Grondaskan and Holtaskan heritage, connected more deeply with their nearby cousins, the subterranean Kulanet dwarves who lived beneath Geb. These Kulanet dwarves provided the Donguni with vast quantities of saltpeter, which they used as a food preservative. While the Donguni certainly used this chemical for its original intended purpose, the alchemists and chemists of the Sky Citadel eventually refined it into something magnificent: black powder. Over the following centuries, the dwarves of Dongun Hold further perfected the creation of black powder and developed the first firearms on all of Golarion. These primitive firearms were further developed and advanced until the Donguni were exceptionally well armed and able to defend themselves. Still, the isolationist streak of the Dongun Hold dwarves continued, even after the supposed death of the Archmage Nex. This isolation finally ended in 4588 AR with the arrival of Ancil Alkenstar. Acting against the advice of her viziers, High King Anong Arunak declared that she and her people would ally themselves with Ansel and his new nation, and thus the modern age came to Dongun Hold. Officially, Dongun Hold is a territorial holding of the Grand Duchy of Alkenstar. That said, this subservience is rarely, if ever, enforced, and the Grand Duke or Duchess of Alkenstar has traditionally left the governance of the hold to the dwarves who live there. Dongun Hold is ruled by High King Anong Arunak, a direct descendant of the lieutenant which Targic had appointed all those millennia ago. The position of High King is historically an office with limited power, intended to be supported by two schools of advisors called the Angles of Repose. Traditionally, the Angles were the true power in Dongun Hold, as each of the two organizations represent the major cultural or economic powers in the city. The Keepers of the Skyflame are the cultural stewards of Dongun Hold, and they manage all aspects of history-keeping, religion, and interdwarven diplomacy. The Gold Hand Lodge, meanwhile, consists of the coin minters, gem cutters, and merchants who manage the nation's economic interests. For many centuries, the Angles of Repose advised the king, and their advice was nearly always interpreted directly into policy. High King Anong Arunak, however, has broken with tradition by asserting her own authority, exercising her official military powers to dissolve much of the control which the Angles had accumulated. Despite these policies, which might be interpreted as authoritarian or tyrannical, High King Arunak has proven immensely popular, and her policies have led to a time of prosperity for the dwarves of Dongun Hold. The renewed focus on the production and sale of firearms to Alkenstar has also led to the rise of a third major faction in Donguni politics, the Sparkforge Collective, a group of gunsmiths and alchemists focused solely on the advancement of firearm technology. Donguni culture is a fascinating mix, which takes aspects of Avistani dwarven culture and merges it with ancient Osiriani and subterranean Kulanet influences. Osiriani influence is most easily witnessed in the unique form of writing which the Donguni employ, a combination of dwarven runes and Osiriani hieroglyphs. Osiriani influence is also seen in the clever use of lovingly constructed and decorated aqueducts, which draw deliberate inspiration from the elaborate irrigation systems which define Osiriani agriculture. The notable Donguni affection for cats is also a result of interaction with the Osiriani. Cats are the most favored animals in all of Dongun Hold, and even the normally stoic dwarves adore constructing decorated climbing towers for their beloved feline companions. Kulanet influence is less visible, but still quite strong. The Kulanet practices of personal hygiene have become a pillar of Donguni culture, which has made the entire Sky Citadel incredibly resilient to disease, and to the poisons of the mana wastes. The other primary influence of subterranean Kulanet culture is the use of forge time as the standard method of timekeeping in Dongun Hold. Forge days ignore the passage of the sun, and instead consist of 32 hours. This longer time period is based around the time necessary to heat a forge to proper temperature, then get in a full period of work before the forge is cooled down for the night. While increased interactions with the outside world have led to a broader acceptance of the 24-hour workday, which the dwarves call coin days, High King Arunak still operates on the 32-hour forge day schedule. For those of you less inclined to do the math, an easy shorthand is to simply remember that 3 forge days equate to 4 coin days. One fun aspect of Donguni culture, which Avistani dwarves in particular might find interesting, is the creation of clan pistols. The practice of forging clan daggers for newborns is as old as dwarven society itself. Baby dwarves in Avistan are presented with a dagger, representative of the clan to which they were born, and they will carry this dagger with them as a treasured possession for the rest of their lives. In Dongun Hold, however, this practice has evolved. Many, though not all, Donguni dwarves have chosen to forge clan pistols rather than clan daggers for their newborns. Rather than the blade being used to cut the umbilical cord during birth, these clan pistols are loaded with a specially crafted blank cartridge and fired off after the child has been delivered to announce their arrival. I imagine this has the added effect of making particularly quiet babies cry and scream as a proof of life. This practice is not universal among Donguni dwarves, and clan daggers can still be found, especially among the more traditionalist clans. The use of prosthetics is relatively common in Dongun Hold, especially since the alliance with Alkenstar has allowed for the proliferation of clockwork within the city. Many of these prosthetics are produced by the Sparkforge Collective, giving the Gunsmithing Guild even more visibility among the citizenry. This practice of prosthetic limbs has its roots in the isolation the dwarves experienced from divine magic while they hid in the Darklands, and their reliance on alchemy and more scientific forms of medicine, which developed as a result. Speaking of the gods, religion in Dongun Hold is a bit different than in most other dwarven communities throughout Golarion. Due to their centuries-long isolation from divine magic, the dwarves of Dongun Hold lost access to the transactional benefits which religious devotion presented to other dwarves. The Donguni, therefore, are more inclined to rely on their own grit and inventiveness than the interference of the gods when faced with challenges. That's not to say that religion within the city is dead, however. The Keepers of the Skyflame have held on to dwarven tradition with a death grip, ensuring that even religious traditions have been maintained to a large degree. At the same time, as the dwarves have reclaimed their abandoned surface dwellings in the Sky Citadel proper, their access to divine magic has returned. As a result, the faith of Torag has returned to prominence, which is unsurprising given the continued Donguni emphasis on forging and smithing. That said, the faith of Angrad, Torag's younger brother and the dwarven god of war, has also risen to prominence in response to the many threats which Dongun Hold faces. The faiths of Bry and Abadar have also gained a foothold in the city. On the topic of threats, the dwarves of Dongun Hold have, unsurprisingly, developed an extremely defensive policy regarding anything they might perceive as a danger. They typically respond with immediate, overwhelming force to anything which might threaten them or their kin, a policy which might seem extreme, but which was developed in response to the unpredictable dangers of Nex, Geb, and the Mana Wastes. While this policy has succeeded in keeping the Donguni dwarves safe, it has also led to some outright tragic missteps. Recently, for example, a group of dwarves was discovered in the Mana Wastes. These dwarves were afflicted with mutations from their time in the Wastes, but were actively seeking diplomatic relations with Dongun Hold. They declared their allegiance to the Hold, and provided some evidence that they had descended from Donguni dwarves. The dwarves of the Hold, however, saw these strangers as potentially dangerous, and High King Aranak sent out a raiding party to destroy their camp and send them back to the Wastes. Unfortunately, these tendencies toward reactionary violence are not the only despicable aspect of Donguni culture. Dongun Hold plays host to a systematically oppressed underclass called the Gang, pronounced like gang but spelled Gangue. This word, gang, refers to the useless material which must be separated from good ore in order to develop workable metal. The Gang are dwarves who are clanless. They are shamed and exist outside of the protections of dwarven society. The Gang are the descendants of dwarves who have acted dishonorably, and their familial sin is typically traced back as far as the quest for Sky, or the retreat during the Nexgeb War. The Gang are forced to suffer in poverty and desperation for the half-remembered sins of their ancestors, and they toil at the most undesirable and dangerous jobs in Donguni society. The Gang are treated as barely better than the dreaded Hringar, and, until very recently, weren't even counted in the official census records of the city. Things are changing for the Gang of Dongun Hold, however, as the emergence of Alkenstar has presented them with something new, a chance at upward mobility. Alkenstar's cultural practice of accepting all those with a willingness to work or a talent for science has presented an opportunity for a new life to the Gang. Many of the Gang have emigrated to Alkenstar City and become valued soldiers. They are hailed as heroes and welcomed as equal citizens of Alkenstar. The Mana Wastes. Alkenstar wouldn't be what it is had it not risen up in direct opposition to the terrible mana wastes. The horrors of this magic-infused wasteland are difficult to overstate, and the region is among the most dangerous places on all of Golarion. Prior to the Nexgeb War, the region which would eventually become known as the Mana Wastes, or the Spell-Scarred Desert, was actually a thriving ecosystem. Plants and animals which had adapted to the lack of water thrived among the sand dunes, rocks, and occasional oases. This all ended when the Archwizards went to war. After more than 1,400 years of intense magical conflict, the entire desert became irradiated with lingering magical energy. This wiped out most of the native animals and plants, and those which remained were warped and twisted by the strange energies which now permeated their environment. In the Age of Lost Omens, the Mana Wastes appear as a barren wasteland, consisting of little more than fields of sand broken up by stretches of cracked earth and rocky crags. Numerous crevices and canyons penetrate the ground, with some running into vast underground cave networks, and others running all the way to the Darklands. Some of these cracks have been covered up by the desert sands, meaning travelers can easily find themselves plummeting into the depths after the ground beneath their feet gives way without warning. Of course, these mundane dangers pale in comparison to the true threats of the Mana Wastes. The whole region has become saturated in raw magical energy. In its purest form, this energy has seeped into the ground, where it pools like water and gathers at the lowest open spaces it can find. This results in many of the aforementioned cracks and crevices becoming filled with bizarre rainbow-colored liquid which radiates multicolored energy. This pooling energy can easily create dangerous effects for those in its vicinity. Legends among the native subterranean Iruxi claim that these condensed miasmas of raw magic have led to agonizing and rapid transformations among their people. Famously, however, neither the congealed liquid magic nor the poison clouds of wellspring magic are the most notable type of magical pollution in the Mana Wastes. That distinction goes to the mana storms. A mana storm is created when pockets of raw magic coalesce in the air and float like a cloud from place to place. These storms can take many forms and can be visible or invisible. They might produce numerous effects on their own, but are most dangerous when they envelop a spellcaster. Whenever a spellcaster attempts to cast a spell in a mana storm, the energy they gather as part of their spellcasting can and will charge the latent energy of the storm. This can lead to disastrous side effects for the caster and all those nearby, as the storm unleashes this newly found charge in functionally random ways. The Impossible Lands sourcebook uses a modified version of the Wellspring Magic table, presented in Secrets of Magic as a baseline, but also openly encourages GMs to get creative and generate new and undefined effects. In short, these mana storms are incredibly dangerous and unpredictable, and can cause untold havoc for any person or structure caught within them. The mana storms can even affect magic items in some cases, triggering wellspring surges in the presence of even the simplest enchanted objects. In addition to the mana storms, the wastes can also suffer from mana droughts. A mana drought is exactly what it sounds like, a pocket of magic dead space which forms and moves throughout the land in an unpredictable fashion. Within a normal drought pocket, all magic is rendered entirely non-functional until the drought passes, meaning spellcasters are completely powerless. Interestingly, not all mana droughts behave the same. Some droughts apply only to low-level spells, while others apply only to high-level spells. Some allow for spells of specific magical traditions, or spells with specific traits, but completely block all other spells from functioning at all. Mana droughts are less overtly dangerous than mana storms, but are no less unpredictable. And yet, despite all this danger, the Mana Wastes are not completely uninhabited. Unbelievable as it may seem, life has found a way to survive in even these harsh conditions. The plants of the Mana Wastes have adapted to this strange environment, by evolving and mutating new abilities and defense mechanisms. Most plants, for instance, have developed some means of absorbing the nascent energy in the air and processing it into a source of food. Occasionally, however, these plants absorb too much raw magic and must expel it. This expulsion, it is theorized, is the source of the liquid magic which I discussed earlier. Other plants have evolved terrifyingly advanced means of predation. Some oases, for instance, consist of magic-absorbing trees, which grow around a hidden pool of quicksand. These trees provide fruit and shade to travelers, tempting them to approach. These travelers then become trapped in the quicksand, at which point the trees begin absorbing any magic to which the traveler had access. These trees are commonly populated by a unique local variant of red-chested magpie. These birds take advantage of the quicksand trap by feasting on the flesh of the travelers as the trees absorb their magic. And that takes me to the fauna native to the mana wastes. Some animals have adapted to the dangers of the wastes remarkably well, though they are the exception rather than the rule. Oozes and slimes are remarkably well suited to the region, and many still populate the wastes. More frightening than these, however, are the flesh-warped monstrosities which roam the landscape. These beings might have once been animals, men, or something else, but most of them have long abandoned any semblance of their former life. Some of these beings were formed thousands of years ago in the Nexgab War, but most of them were transformed far more recently by the pervasive eldritch energies of the region. These beings are distinctly separate from the flesh-warp ancestry, however, though plenty of members of that ancestry might be found among the mana wastes as well. Moving on to the sentient humanoids of the wastes, the most prominent among them are the Kolo, the Goblins, and the Iruxi. The Kolo, much like the giants I discussed earlier, typically survive as nomads, scavenging what they can, hunting prey as it presents itself, and raiding travelers and villages as needed. While they might be thought of as little more than savages by the Alkenstari, they still present a complex culture, and have a particular affection for creating complex and intricate jewelry. The goblins of the mana wastes typically belong to the Cindersnort tribal group. They have survived in the wastes by focusing on the reverse engineering of guns and alchemical items stolen from Alkenstar. The goblin propensity for inventiveness and fire have both shown through in these efforts, as Cindersnort weapons have quickly developed a reputation for being both creatively fashioned and dangerously explosive. That said, they've allowed the goblins to survive despite the much larger dangers of the wastes, so they are certainly effective despite their shortcomings. The Iruxis of the mana wastes have developed the most stable society in the region. Once an almost exclusively subterranean people, the Iruxis who returned to the wastes after the conclusion of the Nexgab War were forced to largely abandon the cave networks they had once called home. These caves had become permeated by magical pollution, exposing those who lived within to new horrors and potentially dangerous mutations. On the surface, the Iruxis then set to work establishing new villages and settlements. The largest of these, and indeed the largest settlement in all the mana wastes, is Gitna, a town well known for its impressive defenses. Many Iruxis, however, chose instead to take up a nomadic lifestyle, traveling between settlements and towns to gather resources and establish trade routes. These Iruxi travelers eventually developed such an expertise at navigating the wastes that they became the premier guides in the region. The term buso was coined to mean a guide through the mana wastes, and it is used almost exclusively to refer to Iruxi guides and scouts. These busos are seen as so vital to life in the wastes that even raiders and marauders like the giants will often leave them alone. This restraint, however, does not apply if the buso is suspected to have access to one of the rare and coveted wandering compasses. These devices are rumored to be able to point to the nearest magically stable pocket in the mana wastes, and are considered to be among the most valuable treasures in the wasteland. Finally, the mana wastes also play host to several gangs of particularly dangerous wizards. Known collectively as Los Aterradores, these gangs are far from a unified faction. Though the earliest gangs in the wastes were formed from deserters from Nex or Geb who were seeking autonomy, nowadays they have evolved and grown. These casters are especially dangerous, and are known to cast first and ask questions later when it comes to dealing with strangers. The individual gangs are extremely protective, and are openly hostile to one another. They view non-spellcasters as inherently inferior, though even in their own ranks they treat prepared arcane casters as the mightiest and most deserving of leadership. The Lich Alemayahu leads the most dangerous of these gangs, since his defection from Geb during the war thousands of years ago. His influence was a large part of why wizard gangs in the Wastes became so dangerous and standoffish. Generally speaking, the wizard gangs of the Wastes should be avoided at all cost, since they have a propensity for violence, and it takes very little provocation to set them off. Ancestries for player characters. Now it's time to dig into some player-facing information which you can use to build your characters for Outlaws of Alkenstar. Kicking things off, PCs are expected to be citizens of Alkenstar City, or at least the broader region. This provides players with a wide variety of ancestry and heritage options to choose from. Humans are the most prominent ancestry in Alkenstar, and humans of Osiriani, Gurundi, Kelishite, and Vudrani descent are the four most common ethnicities in the region. I use the word human here, but human-based Ayuvarans and Dromar aren't uncommon either. After humans, dwarves are the next most common ancestry in the region. The dwarves of Dongun Hold are a common sight throughout all of Alkenstar, but the lesser-known Kulanet dwarves from Geb might just as easily exist within the city as exiles or visitors from their homeland. Less common than the humans and dwarves of the region, gnomes, goblins, and halflings are still fairly common throughout Alkenstar. Gnomes from across Golarion are drawn to the Clockwork Metropolis for its enthusiastic embrace of invention and creativity. This boundless atmosphere of innovation makes Alkenstar one of the best places on Golarion for gnomes to easily avoid the effects of the bleaching. Goblins have found that their innate destructive creativity also flourishes in these circumstances, and they are less discriminated against in Alkenstar than throughout most of the Inner Sea region. Halflings, meanwhile, have found that their small size and propensity for luck have many uses in the narrow streets and bustling industrial centers of the city. Most halflings in the region are members of the Jarek ethnicity. A few other ancestries might have thematic connections as well. Several tribes of Kolo, sometimes called Gnolls, live semi-nomadic lives in the Mana Wastes. The same could be said for the Iruxi, sometimes called lizard folk, who live a semi-subterranean lifestyle. Though they are relatively rare within the city of Alkenstar itself, a Kolo or Iruxi who puts their natural strength and resourcefulness to use could very easily fit in within the city. Elves and Ayuvarin of the Voronoi ethnicity are a bit less common in the region than humans and dwarves, but might find their long lives well suited to scholarship and invention within the clockwork chaos of Alkenstari culture. Isoki, or ratfolk, are relatively well suited to life in Alkenstar as well, and are fairly common in the region. Finally, fleshwarps might be the best thematic representation of the dangers of both science and magic, in a campaign which uses both ideas with regularity. Fleshwarps in the region might have been formed through exposure to the Mana Wastes, exposure to the unique pollution of Alkenstar City, directly from the flesh forges of Nex, or through bizarre experimentation by some mad Alkenstari scientist. Regardless of their origin, they might find their bodies well suited to life in Alkenstar, but might also be discriminated against after having been identified, correctly or not, as a Mana Waste mutant. Looking at versatile heritages, players have even more options they can choose from to further flesh out their character concepts. Due to the proximity of Geb to Alkenstar, plenty of Dampiers might find themselves drawn to the Clockwork City to escape their undead parentage. Meanwhile, both the Mana Wastes and Nex could reliably produce all forms of planar scions, from element-aligned Nari or Sylphs to the primordially chaotic Gonzi Nephilim. Even Alkenstar itself might produce a number of Talos, due to the strong presence of metal throughout the city. Classes for player characters. Before I dig too deeply into classes for PCs, I need to reiterate a few points about Outlaws of Alkenstar more broadly. There is a weird tension in this campaign between the official lore and the actual game mechanics. Like I mentioned earlier in my history and lore section, Alkenstar suffers from Bronzetime and Surgetime, which wildly impacts the effectiveness of magic. All of Smokeside, according to the official lore, is completely magic dead, and there's a curfew in place which limits the movement of at least some spellcasters to specific regions of the city. None of this is represented mechanically in Outlaws of Alkenstar, since Paizo has taken the approach that individual tables should decide for themselves how anti-magic they want the setting to be. Unfortunately, this also puts the combat balancing for this campaign in a very weird place. Plenty of enemies are easily taken out with magical damage types like electricity, but a party which takes the lore of Alkenstar seriously wouldn't really make use of mages, and could therefore struggle against these fairly common enemies. With all that in mind, let's dig in. I'll be making class recommendations that work thematically with the setting, but also try to address some of the narrative mechanical gaps that the AP presents. Martial classes are very common in the Duchy of Alkenstar, in large part due to the unreliability of magic in the setting. Firearms are the most iconic piece of equipment in Alkenstar, and indeed, Alkenstari gunslingers are a great thematic choice for this campaign. That said, gunslingers in this campaign will suffer in matchups against a multitude of enemies who have some amount of physical damage resistance, even at low level. This issue has been partially mitigated with the recently released remaster changes, but it should still be taken into consideration. This issue will hit pistoleros especially hard, since mindless enemies are also common and will be immune to their bluff techniques. If you're interested in playing a gunslinger, I might suggest the Way of the Gunsmith product on Pathfinder Infinite. It adds some crafting flavor to the gunslinger class, and also provides access to alchemical and magical damage types. Up next, the Inventor might be the most thematic choice for this campaign, and any invention which grants access to electricity damage will be especially useful. After that, the Metal Kineticist is also a great thematic choice, and will serve well on the front lines in this AP. The Guns and Gears sourcebook also provides some new archetypes and feats which might apply to other classes like the Fighter or Monk, including the Sterling Dynamo for characters with prosthetic limbs, or the Black Powder Stance feats for gunpowder-enhanced martial arts. Broadly speaking, melee characters will do fairly well in this campaign, since a lot of enemies either can make opportunistic strikes, or will rely on ranged attacks, which can then trigger opportunistic strikes. Now, because casters aren't a great fit for this campaign thematically, I also suggest looking at the following third-party options to give you a wider pool of character options to select from. In the Barbarians Plus supplement, Team Plus introduced the Wrecker Instinct, which focuses on destroying clockwork and constructs, which could be very powerful in this AP. The Alchemical Instinct, however, is my preferred instinct for a barbarian in this story, as it embraces a degree of inventiveness which will gel very nicely with this campaign. In the Magus Plus supplement, Team Plus also introduced the Horizon Spell Shell Hybrid Study, intended for gun or crossbow-wielding Maguses. Moving on to the more skill-focused classes, the Alchemist is the premier choice in this campaign. The Bomber Alchemist is probably the best option for its ability to deal a wide variety of damage types, though the Mutagenist could serve effectively on the front lines. Looking at third-party options again, Team Plus has also produced the Gadgeteer class archetype for the Inventor, which leans hard into a support role by focusing on the production of a large number of gadget-type consumables. While the Rogue and Investigator classes might fit nicely into the narrative elements of the campaign, they will likely struggle in combat situations throughout the entirety of the story. Many enemies are outright immune to precision damage, so these classes' primary damage mechanics will likely be rendered ineffective with a degree of frequency that some players might find frustrating. Now let's talk spellcasters. Before I begin, I want to reiterate that spellcasters are generally antithetical to the setting of Alkenstar. At the same time, they can also be incredibly effective in this campaign, from a purely mechanical perspective. If you are interested in playing a spellcaster, I strongly recommend talking to your GM about if and how they will implement the mechanical limitations on spellcasting in Alkenstar and the Mana Wastes. For instance, how magic dead is Smokeside at your GM's table? Does most magic fail to work, or can specific spellcasters still make their spells function? One potential workaround might be Clerics of Bry. Clerics are quite powerful in this AP, and Bry's presence in the City of Clockwork is strong enough that she might be able to manifest her power as spells, despite the magical afflictions plaguing the land. Another caster who could justifiably function narratively might be the Construct Eidolon Summoner. Even if the summoner's spells were suppressed in specific places, it might make for a fun story if the summoner could still summon their Eidolon in places like Smokeside. Looking at third-party options, Team Plus has released the Mechanism of the Otherworldly Witch Patron. This patron is some mysterious entity with a connection to clockwork and constructs, and grants the witch access to the arcane spell list, a construct familiar, and a hex which allows for the spontaneous creation of consumable gadgets. From a narrative perspective, I really like the idea of some powerful entity, be it Bry, a metal elemental, or some mysteriously powerful construct, who has worked out a means of providing functional spells in places like Smokeside, but which must act through a witch rather than a cleric or oracle to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Like I said, work with your GM and your tablemates. There's fertile ground for rich storytelling here, with or without spellcasters, so I really encourage you to make this AP your own. Religious options for player characters. Moving on to take a look at deities PCs might follow, Bry is easily the single most thematic deity for this campaign. My next video will be a deep dive into Bry's faith, but as a brief overview, Bry is the goddess of clockwork and innovation. Her faith plays a major role in Alkenstar, and even reaches to Dongun Hold and Nex. The Church of Bry is one of the major political powers in the region, and priests of Bry are held in high regard. In addition to Bry, the deities Cassandra and Kaldamash might hold specific thematic appeal to characters from Alkenstar. Cassandra is a recently ascended goddess from Numeria who has domain over constructs and artificial life. Though her faith is relatively new, she has substantial overlap with Bry, and her faith will likely take root and flourish in Alkenstar in the near future. Kaldamash, meanwhile, is an Arcadian god with domain over firearms, birds of prey, and honorable combat. Kaldamash teaches his followers to treat firearms as dangerous tools, which must be handled with respectful care, and to live according to a code of honor. Kaldamash provides a specific code for his faithful to follow, called the Star Code. A bit more broadly, the Wheels of Innovation pantheon also holds major appeal throughout Alkenstar. This pantheon was newly published in Divine Mysteries, and consists of 6 deities who focus on both artistic and inventive creation. The member deities are Bry, the goddess of clockwork; Torag, the dwarven patriarch and god of smithing; Nocticula, the goddess of artists and redemption; Cassandra, the goddess of artificial intelligence; Akriti, the goddess of ooze-kind and change; and Barnarol, the imperial lord of innovation tempered by responsibility. While this pantheon was published after the publication of Outlaws of Alkenstar, it is still a great fit for the campaign, and the setting as a whole. The Church of Abadar, god of civilization and commerce, also holds a position of power in Alkenstar City. Abadarians might connect to the themes of justice and law present in this campaign, but PCs who serve the Master of the First Vault might find themselves struggling to come to terms with their outlaw status and their need to commit crimes. Within Alkenstar, the Church of Abadar has a presence in the banking and law enforcement sectors, and also collaborates with the Church of Bry to produce and distribute the Whisper Sheets. Outside of Alkenstar City, the next largest city in the region is Dongun Hold, the sky citadel of the Donguni dwarves. While religion is a complicated position in Dongun Hold, due to the city's centuries-long isolation from magic, the faiths of Torag and Angrad have taken root and are prominent among the citizenry. Torag is the patriarch of the dwarven gods, and focuses on community defense and crafting. Angrad, meanwhile, is Torag's younger brother, and is the dwarven god of war. His teachings are more offensive in nature. Finally, the faith of Erastil plays a surprisingly large role in Alkenstari life. Rangers, hunters, scouts, and farmers dedicated to Erastil are responsible for the non-standard agriculture which supports Alkenstar's large population. These devotees face the many challenges of the mana wastes, so they can carve out a life for themselves and their neighbors without further damaging the surrounding environment. Campaign backgrounds. Like all Pathfinder 2e adventure paths, Outlaws of Alkenstar presents several campaign-specific backgrounds to players to help their PCs connect to the story of the AP. In this case, each of the 6 backgrounds is intended to connect your PC to either Ambrost Mugland or Angelique Loveless, and provide them with a motivation to see both of these characters brought down. Each one also explains what manner of crimes your character has been accused of, and why they are living outside the law. First up, Banished Bryites are characters who were once valued members of the Church of Bry. You were on the verge of making a discovery among the Church's collection of research notes, but this discovery drew the attention of Ambrost Mugland. After refusing his demands to hand over your notes, you found yourself accused of stealing church funds, and even dabbling in heresy. These accusations stemmed from Mugland himself, but they carried enough weight to get you kicked out of the church, and charged with some serious criminal offenses. In addition to being trained in religion and Bry lore, you gain the Quick Identification skill feat. Next, the Framed in Ferris Quarter background represents characters who lived their life as a laborer in the Ferris Quarter, a rough neighborhood of the Smokeside district of Alkenstar City. This background is the most open from a story perspective, since the crime of which you've been accused is not specified. All that's clear is that you have been framed. You absolutely didn't do what the Shield Marshals think you did. And all you know is the name of the officer who signed the warrant for your arrest. Angelique Loveless, a woman known for her corruption. In addition to being trained in crafting and engineering lore, you gain the Specialty Crafting skill feat. Inexplicably expelled characters are those who have been accepted into the prestigious Blythier College, the only magical and alchemical university in all of Alkenstar. You were on the path to success. Your research had taken an exciting turn in the field of explosives, and you could sense a breakthrough around the corner. Then, it all came crashing down. You suddenly found yourself expelled, facing accusations of theft from a mysterious source, the powerful crime lord Ambrost Mugland, who apparently wanted your research quashed by any means necessary. In addition to being trained in crafting and academia lore, you gain the Alchemical Crafting skill feat. Ratted out gun runners are the most explicitly criminal background presented by this AP. You were a gun runner on the Ustrati River outside of Alkenstar City, smuggling stolen firearms from the Gunworks to illicit buyers in the capital. Even so, you weren't an especially bad person, and serious crimes like murder never crossed your mind. After refusing to surrender a cut of your profits to Ambrost Mugland, he sold you out to the Shield Marshals. Though you managed to escape your arrest, you are now a known and wanted criminal. In addition to being trained in stealth and firearm lore, you gain the Experienced Smuggler skill feat. Snubbed out stoolies are characters who once served the Shield Marshals as an accomplished informant. You were a skilled undercover operative who fed information on bootleggers and assassins to the authorities, and infiltration was your specialty. But, one day, that all went up in smoke. To your horror, you discovered that the records of your service had all been erased, and now the very officers you had worked to protect thought you were a criminal. All you know is that Deputy Shield Marshal Angelique Lovelace was the one who destroyed your career, though what she was trying to cover up is a mystery to you. In addition to being trained in deception and underworld lore, you gain the Lie to Me skill feat. Finally, the Wanted Witness background is another background which is extremely open-ended and could fit a wide variety of characters. You are a relative newcomer to the city, and you have a fascination with the clockwork majesty of the city of Smog. Through some twist of circumstance, you found yourself looking for work at a mysterious gathering of Alkenstar's underworld elite in the capital district. Though you're not entirely sure what you did, you somehow drew the wrong sort of attention to yourself, and now you've been wrongfully declared a wanted outlaw. The only faces you remember recognizing from your brief encounter with the underworld are Ambrose Mugland and Angelique Lovelace, so they are the only lead you have to begin clearing your name. In addition to being trained in society and Alkenstar lore, you gain the Read Lips skill feat. GM Advice. Normally, this would be the end of the video, but Outlaws of Alkenstar is a kind of special case as far as APs go. This AP has a lot going for it in terms of creativity, setting, and flavor, but it is hampered by a few issues that GMs should take into account before running it. For that reason, I've put together this last section of the video as a collection of GM tips. This is not intended for players, and I am therefore issuing a major spoiler warning. This section could spoil huge sections of the AP, so do not watch this unless you are a GM or have already played this campaign. You have been warned. Alright, first things first. Outlaws of Alkenstar suffers from a major discrepancy between the lore of Golarion and the mechanics of the campaign. Though the presence of the mana storms is a well-established aspect of the lore in Alkenstar, this story element has not been implemented in any way in the AP as written. There are no mana storms in the city, no Bronzetime or Surgetime mechanics, and even Smokeside is not written as Magic Dead in a mechanical sense in the AP. Fortunately, the good people over at the Outlaws of Alkenstar subreddit have got us covered. Reddit user LemurOption has provided a series of Whisper Sheet handouts which describe the hours of a given day as either Bronzetime or Surgetime, and has provided rules for how this designation might impact spellcasting within the city. I really like this system, though I also recognize that this mechanic might be difficult for GMs to track at the table. If you're interested in this mechanic, I might suggest working with your tablemates to designate one player as the Weather Tracker, just like you might designate another as the Loot Tracker and a third as the Note Taker. Additionally, I suggest working with your players and their intended party composition to figure out just how Magic Dead Smokeside really is at your table, as well as how tightly enforced the citywide curfew on mages is, since neither of these features have been detailed mechanically by the AP. Up next, I want to address the issue of maps. While the large-scale maps in this AP are pretty good at providing a flavorful, high-level view of the major locations, there seems to have been some disconnect between the AP writers and the cartographers. The story makes reference to a few locations which simply don't appear on the official city map, in a way that might take some players out of the experience. Thankfully, once again, the Outlaws of Alkenstar subreddit has come to the rescue. Reddit user Canon Fedarian has produced this map, which I've linked in the description, which better reflects the as-written geography of the city. I suggest using this map when working with your players. Additionally, the Mana Wastes map in Book 2 doesn't provide a lot of useful information, so I suggest just scrapping it and using something else to guide your players, or heavily editing it to include some of the more relevant examples, or heavily editing it to include some of the more relevant locations. Next, I want to clarify that Alkenstar is a remarkably flavorful setting for an adventure path, full of plenty of rich details for players to experience. Near the beginning of this video, I described it as a fascinating mix of the mythical American Old West and a North African take on a clockwork metropolis. Broadly speaking, Outlaws of Alkenstar definitely nails the Wild West aspect of this mix, but as a result, the North African clockwork aspect gets a little overshadowed. The Impossible Lands mixes elements of Arabian, Egyptian, Persian, North African, and even Indian culture together in a truly unique way, and this AP seems to sideline some of that in favor of a stronger Old West vibe. If this works for your table, that's totally fine, but I definitely suggest reading the Alkenstar section of the Impossible Lands sourcebook to get a feel for the unique cultural mix that the region has to offer. As a more specific piece of advice, you as the GM should make yourself very familiar with the Barrel and Bullet Saloon. This site can easily serve as a base of operations for the PCs, especially after they learn Phoebe Dunsmith's true motivations. Book 1 of the AP provides an article on the bar, as well as the many richly detailed NPCs who populate it. Any one of these NPCs might work as a backup PC in case of an untimely death, or could simply provide the PCs with some recurring side characters with whom they can banter, and from whom they might receive the occasional side quest. Moving right along, this AP does a pretty good job of making Ambrose Mugland feel like a major recurring villain, with a personal grudge against the PCs. Unfortunately, the same can't quite be said for Angelique Lovelace. While she shows up occasionally, the PCs might feel like her broader plan and goals feel a little disconnected from their efforts with Mugland. How you resolve this is ultimately up to you, but I might suggest throwing an extra encounter with Lovelace's goons somewhere in books 1 or 2 to remind the players of her interest in them or the connection between her and Mugland. And of course, the biggest complaint with this AP is the weird thematic disconnect between Book 2 and the surrounding plot. Book 2 exists in this odd place, narratively. The Cradle of Quartz is an interesting locale, but the players don't actually accomplish anything meaningful for having gone there. While they succeed in rescuing their target NPC to prevent information from falling into the hands of the villains, it ultimately doesn't matter, since the villains get that information off-screen anyway. This turns the entire Cradle of Quartz into a narrative cul-de-sac. At the same time, players will probably be upset if you just cut the dungeon entirely, since that is the only time the PCs will get to explore the mana wastes and fly on an airship, both of which are major appeals of Alkenstar as a setting. I suggest checking out the subreddit for some proposed solutions to this problem, since I can't tell you what will work for your table. At the high level, though, I think you need to find some way of making the player's accomplishments feel meaningful, without completely derailing the villain's plan and ending the campaign early. Lastly, I want to talk about some specific mechanical concerns GMs should be aware of before running this campaign. First up, the chase and victory point systems come up a lot in this AP, so I suggest learning those in advance and watching an actual play of how a chase works. Maybe have your players watch it with you. The channel How It's Played has a great series on PF2E mechanics, with multiple videos on chases and similar subsystems. Secondly, a few bosses in this AP are way too strong and might need to be tuned back a bit to maximize fun at your table. Infamously, the Claws of Time boss in Book 2 can easily turn into a TPK if not run very carefully. The Clockwork Puppeteer from Book 3 also has the potential to turn into a party wipe. For both of these bosses, as well as a few other challenging fights, the Outlaws of Alkenstar subreddit has some great suggestions. And, before I close out this section for GMs, I want to make one more suggestion. This isn't something the AP does wrong, it's just an idea I had for how to start the campaign off with a bang. As written, Outlaws of Alkenstar begins with the PCs carefully planning a bank heist, then executing on their plan. This can be a great opportunity for the PCs to start working together as a team, but also has the chance to bog down the start of what is generally a high-octane adventure. My suggestion, then, is to start this AP in media res, with the bank heist already underway. So, how could you go about this? To start things off, I suggest using a normal Session 0 with your players to get a feel for what the party breakdown will be. After that, I suggest working with each player individually to play out one aspect of the planning with Phoebe Dunsmith. Each player could be given responsibility for solving one of the problems which the bank heist presents. Then, this could be resolved through one-on-one roleplay and skill checks with the GM. This solution could then be written out as a vignette, a flashback to show how that PC solved the problem. Then, when the players sit down at the table, the heist can kick off right away, and as each vignette's specific challenge crops up, that PC can read their vignette as both a solution to the problem and an introduction to their character. In addition to turning up the urgency of Session 1 of this AP, this also allows you as a GM to potentially provide the PCs with a bit of extra equipment or information to make sure the AP gets off to a smooth start. If the PCs use a lot of one-handed firearms with low damage dice, for instance, you might want them to roll up to the bank heist with some alchemical items or ammo, which will help them deal with the clockwork guards, despite their damage resistances. Well, if you still want to play Outlaws of Alkenstar, then this video should have provided you with enough information to get started. If you and your group decide that this AP is for you, then I strongly suggest that each player read the official player's guide from Paizo. The GM should read that as well, but should also look at the Impossible Lands sourcebook to flesh out their understanding of Alkenstar and the Mana Wastes. I quite like this AP overall, and I think it has a lot of potential for a group of players who want a fast-paced action story. Outlaws of Alkenstar has the most unique setting of all the low-level Pathfinder 2e APs, and that gives it a strong sense of identity. I'll be back in a week with a new video in my Pathfinder Deities series, this time focusing on the most prominent deity in Alkenstar. Up next is Bry, the Whisper in Bronze, the goddess of innovation, scientific discovery, and constructs. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.